Now we're going to start that. Marvelous. Nonprofit, Board Strong is a nonprofit dedicated to working with nonprofit boards. We do consulting, training, and board matching. Our mission, our belief is that trained, effective governing boards make for more impactful and successful nonprofit organizations. And so that's why we are hosting these roundtable series. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Joanne Florino. She is the chair of the New York Council of Nonprofits Board of Directors and is also the Adam Meyerson Distinguished Fellow in Philanthropic Excellence at the Philanthropy Roundtable. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Joanne.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you to everyone who's on the call today. I'm joined today by two folks who have lots of experience with boards, working on boards, recruiting for boards, managing boards, and so I'm going to ask them to each introduce themselves. We'll start with Althea Luehrsen.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for having me. Again, I'm Althea Luehrsen. I am the CEO of Leadership Buffalo, which is a nonprofit organization located in Buffalo, New York, which has over 4,000 graduates, many of who are seeking board service. I'm also a certified executive and leadership coach. Probably most applicable for today, I serve on 8 boards. I report to a board of 19 people and do a lot of helping with people getting an opportunity through the work I do at Leadership Buffalo to serve on boards. 2 of the boards that I happen to sit on is I'm chair of Western New York Board Strong, and I'm also serve as a board member for the Board Strong of New York State. Again, I have a lot of experience with board members, the good, bad, and the ugly. So I will turn it over to Doug, and so he can take it from here.
Hi, I'm Doug Sauer, I'm former Nikon CEO. Currently an independent advisor to Nikon. Served on a number of boards, currently as president, otherwise. Currently, I'm on the board of the National Council of Nonprofits, the Board of Supervisors for First Nonprofit Companies, the Baby Institute of Albany, and Rouse, the Senior Housing Program. So,
Well, thank you, Doug. And obviously, I am one of the board members you've had to manage as a CEO for several years. So I will say a little bit about myself. I come from the philanthropy side of nonprofits, and so I've had to answer to 2 different family boards, and that is certainly a totally different dynamic than most people are used to. And I work now at the Philanthropy Roundtable, which is based in Washington, D.C., and I provide the advice on governance and management to our members. So that's where I'm coming from here. So I want to get started a little bit talking about, why any board member would be defined as difficult or a problem. And Doug, we should go with that. What have you seen? What constitutes a really problematic board member?
There's a couple of things there. A problem to who and why, and gets into a lot of dynamics around the situation. So sometimes a board member, is it a serious problem? Like has a threat to the organization fiduciarily? Is the person violating policies? Is there conflict of interest? Is there harassment or bullying going on? Are there that level of activities? Or are we talking about problem board member being somebody that doesn't show up to meetings, or somebody who a treasurer that doesn't fulfill their responsibilities, or a board president that's not available most of the time? Or is it an issue of personality, a curmudgeon, if you will, or somebody doesn't get along with the executive director, or board members aren't getting along personally. So it depends on what the scenario is. What's the seriousness of the situation? And then you have to really diagnose it. Is it something that's been brewing and people haven't dealt with it for a long period of time? Is it something that's a situational thing that just emerged? So you have to look at the totality of it, the people involved, why it's there. The difficult board member may not be the problem. Difficult board member may be because the organization's culture has not the person's operating outside the culture. Culture could be dysfunctional. The board member is functional, and is creating problems for the folks that don't want to hold up their end of things. So it's probably whether it's a difficult board versus a difficult board member, and looking at it from that perspective. So just kind of opening it up, and then once you have that, then you got to talk about who else is involved, what's the process for resolving the situation, and what can be done by it. And in a lot of cases, I give a good example of a board in New York City years ago that they yell at each other all the time. I go to the board, they're screaming at each other, but that's normal for them. And it took me a while to get used to that they argue and fight, and that's the way they are, and they function well. But for me, I come from a different culture. What are you doing? Screaming at each other and fighting like that. So for them, though, that worked within that particular kind of organization. So it's what's the source of the problem? Who is it bothering it? What's the situation? What's the causes of it? And many times it may be that the board itself has allowed things to continue a certain way, and it's gotten out of hand. So just opening that conversation.
So I think most of us think about problematic board members are in terms of the curmudgeon, the person who hogs every conversation, the person who chooses to be unpleasant just for the sake of being unpleasant because, that may just be a personality. But I was really interested in what you said about the culture of the organization. And I want to go to Althea and ask her, first to respond to the things Doug said, but then talk about the way nonprofits can build a culture that allows a board member to function in his or her best possible way.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for sharing all that, Doug. I think, to kind of talk a little bit past what Doug was saying, I look at a board member I've never experienced a real serious problem board member with what Doug was just referring to in the beginning of his chat. But more or less serious, the things like if you are a working board, that you have a board member who is just not showing up. They're a resume builder, I call them, where they're just not engaged, they're not coming to anything. Or if you're a different type of board, if you're more advisory, strategic, advice giving type of board, and you have a board member who's constantly in the weeds, constantly asking too many questions, constantly getting involved. For example, we have policies where I report to the board. I think most nonprofits are like this. I report to my board, and then the staff reports to me. So our policy is that the board comes to me if they have any staff issues or any things they need from the staff. Can you imagine 19 people going to talk to my staff and you have 19 different opinions? So having my board speak as one voice is very important. So if you had a board member who was taking that down and not letting that happen. I do think that the culture, though, is important. And I find the most highly functioning boards are the ones that create a camaraderie with each other. They don't just walk in, do the board meeting and leave. They try to do at least once or twice a year, some type of social activity with each other, whether it's an offsite retreat, whether it's a Christmas gathering, a holiday gathering, whether it's make one of the board meetings in the afternoon and have, a social hour afterwards. So I find that when people get to know each other as individuals and not just as the person who's sitting as the treasurer or the board chair or the director at large, I find that the culture can be a lot better that way. And I think the personalities tend to gel a little better, and that they get to know each other as individuals and human beings versus just the person who sits on the board with them. So I think that really helps create a culture. If you can put a little bit of social into your board.
Thank you, Althea. So Doug, you made me laugh about the board that was screaming at each other because I come from a very loud Jersey City Italian family. And I have never experienced a holiday event where people weren't screaming at each other, but it's actually better sometimes to just get it, because then we love each other. We just scream at each other. But I did work for a board once. I was the executive director for a board that really gunny sacked every issue, over a significant period of time, and things were not ever resolved fully. And then you'd reach that moment of crisis and everything would spill out onto the table. And it's interesting to me because the nonprofit sector has a reputation for avoiding conflict and avoiding disagreement, then, there's been this kind of this longstanding culture of just everybody is so nice. And so I'm going to ask you, Doug, to talk about what the role is in the nonprofit sector for conflict and disagreement, and how that can occur in a very constructive way as opposed to a destructive way.
You're right that everybody's bylaws will probably say what a quorum is, a majority vote, and sometimes 2/3 vote. And you conduct business. If you're on the losing end of that, you move on. That's the way that's true. But very few nonprofits feel comfortable if there's dissension, and people take it personally. And thus, in a lot of cases, people don't make decisions where there's division, or they make a decision that's maybe a one-person veto, which is not necessarily the best decision for the organization. That's the uncomfortableness about the clubbish of some organizations, or feeling it's more like peer relations. Not that you're, and people have relations, and I agree with Althea. It's good to be, know each other personally and be able to move ahead like that as a team, but it is business. And it is serious business as fiduciaries, and people need to approach it that way. It's not just a charitable hobby, and certainly legal ramifications are there. So it requires a good board chair who can facilitate and also move along the business and be able to keep it professional, and also know how to balance it in terms of the relations and the social relations. Sometimes the problem board member is the board chair. That's when things get even more significant and serious, particularly for directors or other board members. So, every board needs somebody, if not more than one person, that can help support the facilitation of decision-making, to ensure things don't get personal when they're unnecessarily getting personal. And it's also something, I'm going to go back to board development, because sometimes you don't know what a person's personality is sitting around that table until they're at the table. And just a trick that we do is we bring people on, and they sit at the board table, and they sit at the committee table, this is an icon, for a couple months before they're officially on the board sitting and making decisions. So there's a sense of what that culture is. And if it's not a fit, both sides can have that conversation. But sometimes you just don't know. And it also depends on the profession. And certainly if you're an advocacy board, there may be a lot of strong positions around mission. If you're an organization that you have a couple lawyers on, you'll find differences of opinion among the lawyers. Sometimes people give a lot of power to lawyers, and lawyer can be the difficult one. So I have to come at it from, you have a set of bylaws, you have a set of rules that you make by and large, that says how you're going to do business in the best interest of somebody else in the mission. And it's okay to have dissension. Conflict is okay. It's when it goes outside the bounds of that, or people violate their fiduciary responsibilities, or they're violating confidentiality, or they make things personal, they're not being civil. And that is an issue in the last 5 or 6 years that has occurred on a number of board members, particularly if people have political differences, then they're bringing those differences from the outside into the boardroom. It becomes very difficult. But you have to treat it as a profession. You have to do professional business, and you got to do it. It's in the interest of somebody else. It's not about you. And it's difficult, but it's always good to have facilitators who have that kind of attitude to the board. People talk to each other in between meetings. You don't leave meetings with people being upset and nobody not going back and connecting. You have to keep folks together and keep it cohesive. And that's often the board chair's responsibility, or sometimes it's the executive director. And that might be very uncomfortable for an executive director to have to manage those circumstances.
And Joanne, if I could weigh in on that as well. I think, Doug's 100% right. I think it has to be the strength of the board chair, which is important when you're picking your board chair, making a decision on who's going to be that board chair. As he said, it's a profession. And a lot of times I think boards treat board members, because nonprofit board service is not paid, as we all know, that it treats it like a volunteer, and you can't fire a volunteer. And I think you have to manage your board as the board chair and the executive director, just as you would your people that work for you, because they do. I'd like to give specific examples, and I won't name what organization this was, but I was on a board where the board chair, there was some conflict because the executive director had hired a family member, And that there was no policy written against that. And the family member was very valuable and was an outstanding employee. The person did not need a job. It was just the matter of being hired. The best person was being hired. But there were several board members that were just up in arms about it and they couldn't let it go. And after like a year of this, the board chair finally said, this is it. I've had enough. This conversation is over. She's been here for X amount of time. She's a valuable employee. And he was able to show that leadership, and not in a yelling way, because I never am a fan of people yelling at each other. I don't think anybody listens then. But he was able to, and somebody wasn't, a couple of people weren't very happy with him, but it ended, it stopped. And that person stayed at that organization for 9 years and was a huge loss when she left. So I think it really comes down to when you're thinking about who is your next chair in your term limits and your succession of your board members, it's very important to make sure that you have a strong person in the chair role, a strong person with leadership. Because if you don't have that, I'm on another board right now where the board chair is a wonderful person, but things keep going off and down these rabbit holes, and the person does not have the ability to rope it in and to put an end to these ridiculous conversations. And then what happens is other board members get bored, they get glassy eyes, and they just check out and they're not engaged. So it really creates a lot of other problems down the road if you don't have strong leadership.
Yeah,
So-
can I add something to that, Joanne?
Sure.
The issue also comes down to who is that person that's so-called creating the problem. And a lot of organizations don't have the policies and procedures to guide it, and they didn't come up with it around a situation that was just not good. But secondly, if it's a major donor, the major donor may be able to get away with disruptive behavior in doing things, and somebody who's not a major donor may not. If it's a founder on the board, everybody kind of has to be touchy about that. If it is a leader or the board president's creating an issue, it should not make a difference who the person is if the expectation is everybody needs to perform and act in a certain way, in a professional way. But we all have these individual relationships. Diversity becomes an issue in terms of who that person is, or when you bring people of a different voice on a board that hasn't had that voice there, it's very easily point to the person who's the minority voice on that you're the disruptor because this is the way we do things. So there's a lot of dynamics that go into it that you have to be very sensitive about. But once you start setting precedents and then you're trying to stick with precedents, and you're really not being open to different perspectives and different views sitting around the table.
And, Doug, I agree with that too. I think when you have a board member, I sit on a board where there's a challenge such as that, where this person wants to keep pushing his or her weight around and threatens not to give money. And I'm not the chair of that board. And in my opinion, I think that's blackmail. And that's something that person, I'm the school of thought that would be like, we need to still treat that person the same way we would treat any other problem board member. And that isn't a person who's dedicated to the mission of the organization if they're using that to be as a threat, using their money. And I think, to part ways with them, it would hurt probably financially for a short time, but I think it's also like an empty threat. And the more they get away with it, the worse they become. So, yeah.
Yes, I've unfortunately, because I've worked on the philanthropy side, I've certainly witnessed that kind of behavior, or the behavior of folks who think, well, because I am a major donor, I automatically get a seat on the board of this organization. So I think, constantly keeping the focus on what's best for the organization, and also those whom that organization serves, because sometimes we don't look past the organization on whose board we're sitting to remember who's actually receiving the services of that organization and what their needs are, and why it's important for the board to be functioning at its best possible level in order to be sure that that community is served or a specific population is served. But I do want to kind of go back to the beginning and talk about best practices, because sometimes I'm familiar with boards that got very lazy about fulfilling their responsibility to actually identify board needs and new board members. And Doug, I'm not talking about you here, but a long-term executive director begins to actually make the decisions about who's on the board. And the board is, weary, burned out. Doug and I worked with a board that was definitely burned out one time in Ithaca. And they just let they kind of let the executive director run the show. And then I think the board members just begin to little by little, they begin to just lose interest in the organization because they're really not contributing to it. Or they haven't done a good interview process with potential board members to get a little bit of feel for who they are personally and what kind of values they might be bringing to the board. And then they neglect onboarding processes, which are extremely important. And I think the ones that work best are, for me, my opinion, are matching a new board member with an experienced board member who can answer all those questions. You always think about the new board member coming on the board, and they're not going to ask a question like, well, what actually is the culture of this organization when people disagree? But you would ask that of one person. You're not going to say that at a board meeting probably. But I would like each of you to give me sort of 2 or 3 board policies that are essential for making sure that you've put at least some prevention in place for problem board members. So Althea, I'll start with you.
The one that I am adamant about with the board I report to and the ones I sit on is term limits. I think term limits are very important. I've seen many boards that don't have any. You have board members that I met with somebody yesterday. They have board members that have been on their board for 25 years. That's not helping anybody. And again, I think you can, if somebody's a heavy donor and you feel like you have to leave them on the board because they're, a big donor, you can create an ex officio board. You can create an advisory board. You can do a emeritus board. You can do a lot of different things like that. But what I find when you don't have term limits and you have people that are still there over and over, the new people's voices don't get heard and new and fresh ideas don't get brought to the table. It's one board I actually serve on. There's a person who seems to have been on the board forever, and they put these policies in place where there's term limits, but if somebody's important to the board, we can keep them on. I'm like, that doesn't help anybody. But what happens is this particular person, his voice is the only voice that anybody listens to because he's been around so long. So it frustrates other board members to be like, well, what am I doing here? Because you're not valuing my time and information that I can provide and my talent. So I think without those term limits and without being strictly adhered to them, I think you can lose talent. You can lose very good board members because they're going to get burned out. To the point when you mentioned about the tail wagging the dog of the executive doing I think that also comes down to strong leadership of the board chair, where it has to be making sure that the people who are heading those committees, whether it's the governance committee or the nominating committee, that they're actually doing the work that they're supposed to do and not just filling a square on the organization. But I think that the one I really am very strong out is the term limits. I don't know what that noise is. So, does anybody else hear that noise?
Yeah, I'm in it.
Okay, but I would say the first one I would say is the term limits, and then I'll turn it to Doug to see if he has some others.
Other thoughts, Doug?
Yeah, I guess a couple things. One is that the board can't have 20% of the people do 80% of the work. Once you have that, you shift the power dynamic and dependency that allows personality then to rule the organization. So it's better having a smaller board where everybody is highly active and engaged, and to have a large board with a few people carrying them, because that just sets it up for these kinds of problems. The second one is, and I agree about the leadership thing, that most organizations don't cultivate a leadership succession plan. They do it. They'll talk about it with the director, but they don't line people up to be the next board president, and they particularly don't tend to line people up to be the next treasurer. And so then when a board is heavily dependent on somebody to be there because nobody else is there that's qualified or wants it, you're creating a dynamic where that individual may be the problem, or that individual just, the other folks are kind of loose on that. We see, and Barbara concerns like about this, give and get policies, people have it, but they don't enforce it, and it becomes an issue and it becomes a problem. And then some people have been around the board a long time, may not be giving to the extent that they do, and then new people come in and they're expected. All those things kind of create frustration. and conflict. And I agree that we see, Nikon sees a lot of worst case scenarios. So we see board members dating executive directors, and we see board members needing to be removed for cause, which is like the worst case scenario or without cause is even worse because you can't defend it necessarily. Those are the worst case scenarios when you have to go there. Then we'll see bylaws that don't have any provisions about how do you deal with that on a worst case scenario perspective. Yeah. So you really do have to have policies. I think you have to have ethical policies, chain of command policies. People don't go around the executive director to talk to staff. You got to have those in place before you have the problem, because then it's conflictual. And that probably in most cases, what most people complain about is board members going around the chain of command, going around their officers, going around the executive director, blurring those lines, creating problems. And it's hard once that horse leaves the barn to pull that stuff back in.
So definitely a process for removing board members. Yes, that's very clear. And then the other thing I was just going to ask about are, written board member position descriptions and expectations up front that need to be communicated during that process of recruitment.
Right.
So
I agree. Yeah, we have those, and I think it's important to have those in writing, but also making sure somebody is paying attention to, are they being adhered to? Having your bylaws written and then just putting them on a shelf doesn't do anybody any good. And having your bylaws state that there's a giving component, whether it's give or get, or whether it's you have to attend 75% of the board meetings. You can't just have that written down. Somebody has to be monitoring that, whether it's a staff member, whether it's the board chair, to say that this person has missed 75% of the board meetings, and the board chair going to speak to them to say, what's going on. If there's a personal issue, health or something, certainly try to be understanding, but otherwise ask them to step down, because, and that's a tough thing that the people have to do. So if you ever want to get asked to be the chair of a board, know that that's not like a real easy job all the time. But I think having those job descriptions, if you will, for each one of the board members, and with the expectations before they join the board, knowing that you have to give a certain amount, if there is a set amount, you have to attend 75% of the board meetings, you have to serve on a committee, et cetera, et cetera. There's term limits. And if somebody has to monitor that. Again, you can't just write it, give it to them and hope that everybody's paying attention. So I think the part two of that is to make sure someone in your organization, whether it's the executive director in conjunction with the board chair, or it's a staff member who staffs the board, to pays attention with things like that, because otherwise they start to just it becomes the norm that people got away with it, and they don't, then it just becomes the train has left the station.
Or it could be a board development committee, right? Yeah. That takes on the responsibility for them.
I personally like that the committee that brought that board member on, it was responsible for orientation and interviewing and setting up, should be responsible for monitoring their performance, and probably has the relationship with the individual to do that. Now that's for new board members, not those that have been on the board for 30 years and they keep coming back and coming back. But there is an accountability and enforcement, which kind of goes back to our earlier conversation, that people are uncomfortable with that dissension. They're uncomfortable enforcing it. There's a lot of tendency right now, and I think the state of New York, and I know a number of organizations they do audits on governance and stuff. They want paper. They want you to paper it over. So people pull it down from from Nikon or from website, pull it down. Well, we have it, but they haven't embedded it. They haven't incorporated in their board. The board members don't know the policies, much less are anything enforced. So that's the active live kind of board ultimate peer accountability issues, is folks need to hold each other accountable for their service on the board, and because it's about the mission. Again, it's not about what they want to do and what they don't want to do.
So there's I just want to jump in and talk a little bit about structure too, because in terms of the responsibility of the board chair, it's important at any board meeting to be making sure that people who are not speaking are speaking. Right. And so even if it means you have to be, the third grade teacher calling on somebody, actually asking, and I think that's something that's very easy to ignore if you're trying to get through like a quick meeting. But sometimes the committee structure can be so helpful there, because in committees, people have more of an opportunity to talk about something that typically they're more interested in or they're responsible for. And so the board as a whole sometimes can get carried away with, we have to get this done, we have to get this done. But in the committees, there's more opportunity for people to know each other, focus on whether it's the finances, the programs and the services, whatever that kind of drew them to that organization to begin with. But I just want to, kind of say that you've got to give people an opportunity to speak before you make the decision that they're not participating.
Again, Joanne, that goes back to having a strong board chair, somebody who actually has those leadership and facilitation skills. And there's a question in the chat that, what do we do if an ED has, he or she has a weak chair who can't facilitate meetings or make decisions? And Barbara wants to jump in on this, but a part of me would like, just wait for their term to be over, because I don't know what you could do about that, because that person is technically your boss. So, I mean,
Yeah, I think that's a conversation though that could happen. And so let's go to okay, so for all the possible reasons, there actually is a board member who's a problem. It could be the board chair, it could be a committee chair, or it could just be a board member who's behaving badly or not performing duties. What's the resolution of that?
It depends on how bad their behavior. It depends on the consequences of their behavior. Are they violating confidentiality? Are they interfering with staff? Are they harassing somebody? Which rises to the level we need to remove you. I think there's that end, and then I think there's the tough end. They're okay, but they're just not performing.
And I think if it's not the board chair who you're having the challenges with, I think if the ED sees it or another board member sees that behaviors or issues, I think it's up to the board chair to have a conversation with that person, to talk with them about, your attendance has been dismal, you're not coming, et cetera, whatever it happens to be, you haven't paid your annual gifts, whatever. And that shouldn't always fall on the development officer either. I think sometimes it has to go to the leadership. If it's the chair of the board, I don't know. I mean, I guess the only thing I would say is maybe go to the vice chair and maybe go to a trusted member, or maybe because the vice chair typically will follow the chair and see if there's anything that they think that they can do. A lot of times it's just a personality. It's just, they're not trained in leadership. They don't have those skills. It's not that they're a bad person. So I think, but I do think, I feel like I'm putting a lot of burden on the board chairs in this conversation, but I do think it goes back to the board chair.
It is critical. It is critical.
Yeah.
And the board chair has to develop strong relationships, not only with the board members, but clearly with the executive director or CEO.
Yeah.
And I would say the executive committee, because I think the executive committee is the power center.
Right.
Yes.
Ultimately can hold the board chair accountable before you spread it out to everybody on the board and the community. You got to be careful how you manage this. A strong executive committee that can really see itself as also holding board members and themselves, because they do elect the board chair, they can unelect the board chair.
What if you have somebody on the executive committee who's the problem?
That's exactly where the issues are. I mean, that's a board, then that's an overall board issue, because the board elects these people to be in those positions.
Yeah.
I just quickly, Joanne, when you talk about the committees, the average organization doesn't have effective committee structures. They don't hold people accountable to go to committees, and then people don't go. And then boards often don't accept the deliberations and recommendations of committees, and they create their board to be one great big committee. So why go to a committee if the people who didn't come to the committee meeting are going to turn around and complain about it at the board meeting? So committees are by and large, they shouldn't be created unless they're functional and you make them work, and you got to respect them when you do have them, and that will create true engagement. Otherwise, you're wasting people's time and investment.
And boards do need to think ahead of time about how they would resolve serious conflict. I mean, if it is a problem with a board member that threatens it's an existential threat to the organization, like harassment or breaking confidentiality or going outside the organization to, I don't know, conspire with some other organization, or there's just that kind of situation, then I think there's got to be that board removal process.
It's a board, it's a board removal process, or what I've seen a number of times is that the situation becomes so uncomfortable for that individual that at the end they force that individual to resign.
Resign, yeah.
Yeah, that's
But I
more apt to happen.
If a board has been together over a period of time, you know, as board chair, or even just as a regular member of the board, you sometimes can see where the affinities are among the board members. And if somebody is behaving, especially when somebody all of a sudden begins to behave out of the context you're familiar with, it would be easier to have someone who knows that person better begin that conversation. Because sometimes it's somebody's going through some kind of stress or illness that you're not aware of. I just feel like boards were so stressed across the board in 2020 that, you know, holding everybody together and staying mission oriented was hard because people had so much personal stuff going on. But I think you can do it if you've got a board that really wants to support each other.
Yeah, two things with that, Joanne. You often people will go say, who's got the most influence with that person? Have a conversation with, they're going to be more effective than a power move
Right.
on them at that time. The second piece is sometimes these people are frustrated and they stay around because they feel obligated. Sometimes you give them an exit ramp, they'll take it. And we often don't even have that conversation to allow people to take that exit ramp. So it's okay to have that conversation. And if you can do it with somebody that the person more will listen to, there'll be less tension, I think.
You know, and that goes back to committee structure and committees doing what they're supposed to be doing. When you think about if you have a nominating committee or whatever people call it, board of a development committee for the board, when you bring people on like we have 3 2-year terms. So at the end of each 2 years, we reach out to that committee reaches out to the people and ask them, are you interested in continuing for your next 2 years? They don't have to be revoted by our membership, but they do have to see. That gives them an out because sometimes they don't want to continue to be on the board, but they feel like they're stuck or obligated and they don't remember from orientation that they have those, 2 3-year terms. So there's a reason it's not a 6-year term, it's a 2 3-year term. So giving people that opportunity to, I'm on a board right now that I really like to not be on, and for various reasons, they feel that they have to keep me because I have tons of contacts. I'm like, I'll still help you. Like, you don't need to have me on the board for me to help you. So you can still use my network, but having that, I'm the one that came forth with that conversation. It's just not something that I have passion for, and I don't feel like I'm a very good board member. So I feel like it would be best for me to step down. But you can't, shouldn't have to feel like you're handcuffed to a board member. But getting back to the committees too, Doug, when you talked about that, I think if you do an orientation ahead of time, when you onboard your new board members, and when we do this every year, we also ask any former board member, they're all welcome to come and get a refresher and to do that orientation to make sure they understand you have to join a committee. And we actually start assigning committees when they're asked, like from their interest or their skill sets, and make sure that they understand what that committee entails and that they do have an obligation to be a part of that.
I've got one more question. I know there are questions piling up in the Q&A, but before we go there, I would really like to talk about how organizations evolve over time. And so a young organization with its founder at the helm is frequently going to have a board that has its fingers in everything. And so and then there's got to be some kind of evolution of that board, or the board was functioning as a mature board, but suddenly there is some sort of crisis or there's been a transition and the culture of the organization somehow is in flux now because maybe the transition was at the very top of the organization, and boards then begin to sort of jump in to places where they shouldn't go. So I'm sure you've both seen that. Or you've got the founder who really isn't letting the board evolve into a governing board because the founder has been used to calling all the shots. So Doug, why don't you start? And then I'd like to hear your thoughts on that too, Althea, and then we'll go to questions.
I'm a little bit, what do you mean by the question? It's about when there's a power void or a change?
Yeah, when the board, you know, when a nonprofit first forms, often the board is actually functioning as staff. And then, you know, you've got to somehow allow that board to evolve into a true governing board, or it has been a governing board, but there's been a transition that is disruptive in some way. There just seems to be different culture, and the board begins to question things that they might not have questioned in the past, and they're getting into places they shouldn't go. And
Yeah.
so again, I think the chair again is playing a role here, but just talk a little bit about that growth in boards.
Yeah, I think it's change management. A good board is going to be changing all the time, have different influences. It's not going to be the same as it was. And when there's different people sit around the table, that's going to change. What most organizations don't do in strategic planning is they don't do strategic governance plans. They talk about everything else except the board. And where's the board going, and what's the needs of the board, and can the board fulfill the plans? I just saw somebody's plan that someone else had done, and it didn't mention the board at all. 35-page document, did not talk about the board, and the board is the problem in the organization. So I'm a believer, you got to think strategically about your growth or your maturity or your issues. You got to be very honest about it, and that includes how are we doing as a board? How are we going to change? What are we going to do to assume some accountability? And if you get that conversation going and you have honest conversation about it, not just at the moment you got a problem, you can have strategic growth, strategic development of the governance process itself, but you have to have honest conversation. And again, that kind of goes back that people don't want to talk about these things because it gets uncomfortable with themselves. But again, it's not about them. So I usually use, okay, what do you want this board to look like 3 years from now? And what's this board going to do differently? How's it going to perform? And that forces a bit of a conversation about where your limitations are. And hopefully people just don't say, we want more people to come on board and give us money. when that becomes a culture, you got a problem. If they think governance is the problem, that the board shouldn't be governing, and that's where a lot of founders are and a lot of other folks that like controlling the board, they don't want the board to be terribly independent. They don't want a governing board. They want a rubber stamp board that supports usually fundraising and whatever management wants to do. So you have to have those kinds of conversations. But going at it, I think it just has to be part of everybody's strategic. If they're not strategically thinking ahead, they're going to run into it. They got to think strategic, and governance is an important part of strategic planning.
Thanks.
Yeah, my thoughts on that too. Again, I'm going to go back to those. I look at, from what I'm hearing you asked, Joanne, is that when you have someone who founds an organization because it was their idea, and then eventually they become the executive director, and then they're being governed by a board and they're not listening to, or they're part of the board of the nonprofit that they founded, and they stay on and stay on and stay on, and nobody else can, they have the founder syndrome, as you mentioned. Again, I go back to term limits. Go back to those bylaws, go back to term limits, that they have to be written in a way that that person can't be on there for the next 100 years, because that's when there was somebody in the chat that said their board chair has been president for 15 years. I live in a condo building with an association, and the guy has been president for 11 years and it's not working. And so you got to step up and volunteer. But I think that you putting in the bylaws and putting in the term limits that you can't stay on those boards for that many years and stick with that, I think makes a big difference. I think that's how you can get rid of those people that want to just control everything, and they think that because they started it. I've seen it happen where people have actually removed the founder from a board of directors of a school he started, and he's no longer involved. They basically fired him because it became that big of a problem. But you don't grow if you don't change, like Doug said, change management. And I'm a big believer in strategic planning. We do one every 3 years. Board capacity is always one of our buckets. Looking at our board capacity, and I think that's very important. You have to plan for it. You can't just hope it's just going to all work out that way.
I want to thank you both very much. I think we're going to go to questions now. There are a few in the chat, which I'm happy to look at. Barbara, okay with you?
Yeah, I wanted to summarize a couple of them for you, though. when we
Okay,
get
go ahead.
started. Which is, and people will correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's basically, we've had this person on the board, they're new, they've been there forever. We don't know where to start, right? The board chair doesn't want to deal with them, other board member. Do you suggest, is there a process? Do we start writing something down? Agree to have a meeting with this person with bullet points, or somewhere that just helps the people who are nervous about having this conversation get over that hump?
So they're having problems with they're a difficult board member and they don't know, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they're like, well, the guy's mentally ill, there's my executive director is nervous, my board chair, that, yeah, just sort of like they're in the middle of it. It's been going on for a while. So
Yeah.
how do we sort of, how do they step back and really create a plan to introduce the topic and go from there? And just apparently in a couple of these places, and Joanne read them in more detail, but it's like, it seems as though it's been going on long enough that sort of starting to have a conversation out of the blue, as it were, is a challenge.
Yeah, I'm going through that on a board I sit on right now, and there's a very challenging board member, and that we went to the board chair and thought he could, do something about it. He's not. I think again, this is a donor problem in his mind. But what's happening is that when you start to lose other board members, I think that's when it has to get taken seriously. I think it's communication. You have to be able to communicate. Somebody has to have the strength and the leadership to go sit down with that person and really let them know, look, we've heard some feedback from some of the other board members, and be prepared that person may resign from the board. That's okay. But have your documentation in place, specific things of like, this has happened, and why it is a problem. What is it getting in the way of? How is it being not effective for the organization to move forward? So I think if you have, approach it not as a personality thing, like you're just annoying everybody. Approach it with the steps of what it's actually doing, how it's going against your policy, how it's going against the processes, how it's affecting the organization, and really have your facts in place. Not sure it's going to work because difficult people are difficult people. But I do think and again, it should be the board chair that takes that role to be taken seriously by the board member.
We should know that there are a growing number of consumer-directed kind of organizations that have mental health consumers on it, that have people with disabilities, have low-income consumers who are challenging the professional system, if you will. And that's the nature of why they're involved, and often why state wants them involved, is to change what that institutional norm, that professional provider system is. And that says you're going to have conflicts. That says you're going to have difficult people. And to a great extent, it goes to how inclusive is the organization really. I kind of goes back to the beginning. Is the person who's challenging the norm being difficult because they're not being accepted, their voices are being accepted, therefore it comes out in different ways? Is the organization really looking for inclusiveness? Are they really able to handle criticism or differences? And if they haven't been, it ends up becoming a personality thing. It ends up people getting frustrated and angry and shouting at each other or doing other things. So you really need, it goes back to something you said, Joanne, about the voices that don't talk. You need to engage folks to talk, and it's not always comfortable to do that. So you as a culture got to be able to accept constructive criticism, you got to be able to accept different voices, and you got to manage that and manage the change that comes with it, and not turn around and then blame the person.
I think I look at it as really no different than leading an organization that people are working for you, that you're paying. Personalities are personalities, and I'm sure we all have people that work for us, and not everybody's just like the perfect employee. There's challenges, and I guess approaching it how you would approach somebody who worked for you, somebody you're paying a salary to, approach it the same way. Do it in the professional setting that you would not let an employee get away with this. So how come you're letting a board member? So think about that way. And as Doug said a while back, it's a profession being a board member. It's a responsibility. It's not just I'm on the board and I can't say anything to anybody.
Right. There's one question in the chat about, there is a board removal process. It sounds like it would be justified in this case, but the board is hesitant to use it.
Yep.
And there again, I think you've got to call the board back to remembering what the focus of the organization is, what's happening to the services that organization is supposed to be providing in the community. And there's a higher level of responsibility. This is going to be an occasion where everybody won't be happy at the end of it.
Right.
If you've got to engage in this actual board removal process, but there's a bigger good at stake. And I have to say that I think that is that's going to be an ongoing problem. I think because there's this notion that, if you go on a corporate board, number one, you're probably getting paid. And number two, there's a bottom line that you're going to see at every single meeting. And it's not quite the same as a nonprofit. The other thing I wanted to say is I sometimes there's dissatisfaction among board members, or they get bored and they get restless, and then they just get disinterested because they're not hearing enough about the mission of the organization and what it's accomplishing. And I can say, and I will say this to you, Doug, that you've always been very good with the Nikon board about sharing with us, without names, some of the situations that Nikon's been able to get involved in and make good. And I think that matters. And I think sometimes staff can forget that I joined the History Center board because I'm really interested in local history, but I never hear anything about local history because it's all governance all the time. And not that the governance should be pushed aside, but there was a passion that drew a person to a specific organization. And you need to keep rekindling that passion to keep a board member engaged. There is a question in the chat that I'm just going to read really quickly because it's a very, very serious one. Board member reported elements of a board meeting outside of the organization, resulting in a very big problem for the organization. I've been told in such cases, a violation of a board member's fiduciary responsibility, the Attorney General can get involved. Speak to what can be done about violation of non-disclosure.
The first thing is, do they have a non-disclosure confidentiality policy that the board member signs on to annually? I'll bet you they don't. So, and most people, what is confidential? So it's like daycare centers are famous for their parents on the board on the other side. They don't separate that out. So the first thing is, do you have a policy? Is board members aware of that? And that actually should be an ethics statement, should be signed on. And then you got something to hang on for removal, because if you start to go after folks for confidentiality that other folks probably have done in the past and you haven't gone after them, you created another liability issue. And since this is Council Services Plus sponsored, I want to note that, one of the outside of personnel issues, not following the bylaws and removing board members is a good way of getting sued. So you want to make sure that you do it and you do it consistently. A good example is everybody's got in their bylaws, you miss 3 minutes straight, you can be leaving, and then they don't tell people to go. And then when they go after somebody, they say, look at you, everybody else has been doing that for years, and now you're coming after me. So for that situation, you got to have the policies. You got to be clear about confidentiality, what it is and what it's not. And you got to hear to everybody to do it. And if somebody has violated that, it's not the AG that would come in and do something. You're in charge of whether that person is on the board. Remove the person if that's the case.
I hope that person's been removed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Again, that's an important piece because ultimately you're trying to manage something that you're not willing to make a decision about to solve this. It's not the Attorney General coming in.
Mm-hmm.
It's the governance responsibility of the board to make that decision.
Yep.
So,
unless it was embezzlement of funds or something, along those lines, I don't think that, you can't do anything but that from the Attorney General's office. Yeah.
that's right. So I want to look at one more question here, because again, I think it's a story about a board that is getting not old, but discouraged. How does a new ED help deal with a board where the executive committee have all been on the board for 10 to 20 years? They have complete control and new members don't get much to say. We have a lot of turnover on the board and it's hard to find new members. And as a new ED, I tend to think the newer board members have a lot of good to contribute.
Go
I-
ahead, go ahead.
I go back to the term limits. Apparently, they must not have any term limits if they've been on the board and executive committee for that long. I would think what I would do is start to cultivate some of the new board members and really start to work with them individually and find some that have those excellent leadership skills and take charge ability, and see if you can get them more engaged on committees, involved in the organization, so that they start to rise to the top and they start to, you build your own champions, if you will. You build your own team, and then you start to slowly, you're not yourself as the ED doesn't have to try to take them over. You maybe have some people to support you and help do that. And then you're also going to make the new board members feel valuable and included and wanted.
Thanks, Althea. And I think I would say, I see the time is coming to a close, but I did want to say, you chose to serve on a board for a reason. Have the courage to protect the organization and its mission, and especially the services that are, being threatened by a dysfunctional board. You've got to look beyond the personalities and personal feelings being hurt, and keep focusing on the mission of the organization, reminding people why they're there in the first place. And sometimes those folks who have never spoken up before will be the ones who say, I don't want this organization to go down the drain. I'm going to get this organized. And that's the best thing that could possibly happen. So thank you all. And thank you for everyone who's been on the call today.
I'd like to just step in and say thank you, Joanne, Althea, Doug. It's been a great conversation. Really appreciate it. I just put my contact information into the chat. So those of you who have very complicated questions or long questions, please feel free to give me a call. We can brainstorm for a little bit. And of course, I would be remiss in not mentioning that we also do consulting. So if your board has profound or even challenges that you think we can help with, we'd be happy to talk to you about that as well.
Barbara, I'd
And
be happy to, if you want to share my contact information with anybody, if anyone has any, specific questions, I'm happy to chat.
Perfect. And we look forward to seeing you all next month. Our session on the board's role in determining staff benefits. So thank you for joining and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Have a great day.